Today, we will be learning about constitutional monarchies in the West. The gentry were rich non-nobles who dominated the House of Commons and relied on restrictions against the monarch's power to maintain political power. They began facing a threat to their power following the start of the Stuart line. This line consisted of James I, Charles I, Charles II, and James II. People often recall this order by using James Chuck Chuck James. With the start of the Stuart rule, two main questions about the extent of the power of the monarchs arose. Could the monarch govern without the consent of the parliament? And would the Anglican Church follow a hierarchical episcopal, where the king and government determined the church doctrine, or a Presbyterian form, where the church members had control over the church doctrine? The first of the Stuart line was James I, who strongly believed in the divine right theory. This was the idea that since monarchs were appointed by God, their rule was law and nothing should disagree with it. He twice dismissed Parliament over arguments on taxation. The second of the Stuart line was Charles I, who also strongly believed in the divine right theory. He sought to control the Anglican Church, which was an example of hierarchical episcopal, and argued against Parliament over the issues of taxation. Like the rule of James I, England was plagued with debt from the 30 Years' War, and Charles I wanted to establish more taxes to accommodate for this debt. Both houses of Parliament opposed the tax proposals presented by Charles I and created the Petition of Rights in response to the king's continuous demands. The petition stated that only Parliament had the authority to establish taxes, and also implemented the habeas corpus, which was Greek for trials. However, Charles I refused to go by this petition and resolved Parliament. Continued to force taxation on lower classes, implementing new tax systems such as ship money, which taxed English citizens for protection against Navy attacks, even if they were not positioned near coastal waters. Soon afterward, however, Charles I had to recall Parliament due to a revolution in Scotland that took place after Charles I had attempted to impose the Book of Common Prayer onto the Presbyterian Church. In this session, called Short Parliament, Parliament refused to establish taxes if Charles I did not agree to follow the Petition of Rights. Charles I continued to reject this petition and dissolved Parliament again. However, Charles I soon became desperate for money and called into session the Long Parliament. This session was much more successful, and Parliament established that only they could dissolve themselves, and they also declared that they had to meet at least once every 3 years, regardless of the king's orders. They also abolished ship money and the Star Chamber, which had previously been used to suppress nobles. While things looked to become more peaceful, Charles I provoked the English Civil War after attempting to arrest some Puritan members of Parliament that opposed his rule. However, other members and citizens came to the defense of these Parliament members, and Charles I eventually declared war against these opposing members in Parliament, effectively starting this English Civil War. There were essentially two sides to this war: the Cavaliers, composed of Royalists and Irish Catholics who supported the king, and the Roundheads, composed of Puritans and Scottish Presbyterians who opposed the king. Eventually, Oliver Cromwell, a fiercely independent Puritan, led his new model army to victory in 1649. This victory, however, led to a division in Parliament between the Puritans and the Presbyterians versus the non-Puritans. The latter side of Parliament wanted to restore Charles I with some reforms. And upon hearing this, elements of the new model army killed all opposing members of Cromwell in Parliament, an event known as Pride's Purge, and left a rump Parliament with 1/5 of its original members. In 1649, Charles I was beheaded, effectively ending the English Civil War. Under the rule of Oliver Cromwell, England entered a period called the Internegram, otherwise known as a period of time without a king. During this time, England became a military state, with Oliver Cromwell crowning himself as Lord Protectorate. He later divided England into 12 districts, each led by a military official who reported directly to Cromwell. While Cromwell outlawed the practice of Anglicanism and Catholicism, he allowed some forms of religious toleration for Jews. After the death of Cromwell, his son Richard took power. but because he was ineffective as a leader, the Stuart line soon regained the crown in 1660. Charles I succeeded Richard, and during his reign, Parliament was stronger in relation to the king than ever before. Under his reign, there was a development of political parties. For instance, there were the Whigs, who were largely liberal, and the Tories, who were largely conservative. Keep in mind, the definition of liberalism and conservatism were much more different than the definitions we associate with them today. Liberalism in the 17th century simply meant that people were heavy advocates for equality before the law and proponents of the idea of freedom for the individual. And while conservatives believed in the similar topics, they also thought the citizens should be under the rule of a royalist ruler rather than a democratic government. In other words, conservatives were more keen on following traditional customs rather than new movements. While Charles II claimed to be a Puritan to appease the citizens of England, his actions pointed to him favoring the Catholics. For instance, he established the Clarendon Code, which was intended to drive Puritans out of the government. Under this Clarendon Code, the Test Act of 1673 was established, which stated that as long as one was unwilling to receive the sacrament of the Church of England, they were unable to vote, hold office, preach, teach, attend universities, or attend assemblies for meetings. Charles II also took control over Scotland again, and in exchange, he formally recognized the Presbyterian religion in Scotland. However, he soon attempted to impose an hierarchical episcopal control over the Scottish Church by establishing himself as the head of the church. Many Scots refused to recognize Charles II as the official head of their Presbyterian church, and thousands were killed as a result during a time called the Killing Time. In response to these actions, Parliament had passed the Habeas Corpus Act in 1679, which sought to limit Charles II's power. This improved the legal system in England by demanding just trials for prisoners, no matter what social class they were in, allowing the judge to demand the presence of a prisoner, and prohibiting double jeopardy, which was being accused of the same crime twice. After the reign of Charles II was the reign of his brother, James II. James II was not shy about his intentions and was fully dedicated to turning England back to a Catholic country, as well as establishing himself as an absolute monarch. Two actions eventually led Parliament to act. James II's reinstitution of the Declaration of Indulgences, which granted religious freedom to Catholics, and the birth of a male heir. As a result, the Glorious Revolution started in 1688. This revolution was a bloodless revolution that ended with James II peacefully abdicating his throne. In the end, William III and Mary II of Orange were declared joint monarchs by Parliament and effectively took over the rule of James II. After the succession of the throne, Parliament passed the Bill of Rights in 1689. This bill declared England a constitutional monarchy and established Parliament's sovereignty. The Bill of Rights also stated that laws and taxes must be approved by the Parliament, ruled that the monarchs could not be Roman Catholics, and claimed that people now had the right to trial by jury, declared that harsh punishments such as torture or death were not allowed, and announced that representatives in Parliament had to be elected by the people. In addition, Parliament passed the Toleration Act in 1689, which provided religious toleration for Protestants, but not for Catholics or Jews. Furthermore, the Act of Settlement in 1701 declared that if William III of England or his stepsister Anne died without a male heir, the Hanoverian Prince George I would take power. The Act of Union in 1707 was also established, which combined England and Scotland into one state known as Great Britain. Lastly, the cabinet system was established after William III took control. The system was where leading ministers, who were members of the House of Commons and had support of the majority of its members, created common policies and conducted business of the state. The cabinet was led by the Prime Minister, who was also the member of the majority. The first labeled Prime Minister was Robert Walpole. And that concludes the summary of constitutionalism in Western Europe. England was one of the first European states to establish a constitutional monarchy, and no other forms of democratic governments were established until after the American Revolution in 1778. After this date, numerous were inspired to demand reforms for a constitutional monarchy or a democratic government, such as in the French Revolution that started in 1789. But that's a history lesson for another time. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. And if you enjoyed it, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment on any questions you have down below. Thanks so much.